very welcome to you all. We're here, hopefully you will be, I think if you find yourself as very uncomfortable, you may sit on the floor if you like. That would be my own preference. The reason that we're in this space rather than another of the college spaces, of course, because it's in this room that the picture, one of the portraits of Norman Manley hangs, and it's his life and work that we're here to recognise this afternoon. We also have, I'm just going to distribute it, a photograph that was found, identified by one of our speakers, Colin Clark, a couple of months ago, but then hot off the press because the college is currently preparing a history for its 450th anniversary of Norman Manley. As he matriculates, do you think? No, a little bit later.
He's just come back from his duty in the First World War, and it's 1918.
Okay.
But he has been very badly damaged through shell shock, and is still, I think, in a shell shock situation. It's hard to imagine that.
Yeah. So this is, I'm just going to pass this through the audience because we only got this from the photographer on Thursday. So yeah, I don't. The title for this afternoon's talk, Towards a Wider Life, really is to try and capture many of the dimensions of this man's life and some of the things that our speakers will speak about, both in relation to his life, but also, of course, the distinction of his wife, Edna, as an artist. And I just wanted to quote the rest of where this comment comes from, Towards a Wider Life, which is taken from Rex Netterford's edited collection of Norman Manley's speeches and writings. In 1936, he brooded that, quote, the law was emotionally and intellectually too bankrupting, and that he would have to find a way to a wider life. I say this as a tutor who, most of her students in history then go on to do degrees in law and graduate as lawyers and practice that. So there's something about his ambition that we hope to touch on this afternoon.
Welcome, everyone. My name is Patricia Daley. I'm Professor of the Human Geography of Africa here at Jesus College. I'm also a tutor here, and I've been here since 1991. I'm Jamaican by birth. We're here to celebrate the life of our most famous Jamaican alumnus, Norman Manley. But before we do so, I want to mention Jesus College's long association with Jamaica. And I can't mention Jesus without mentioning a Welshman. And this particular Welshman, Reverend Thomas Coke, was the first bishop of the Methodist Church here in Britain. He read jurisprudence at Jesus between 1770 and 1775, graduating with a doctorate at the end. But he later became a missionary, and his link to Jamaica is that he established the Methodist Church at Parade in Kingston in 1852, before moving on to do further missionary work in the United States. The Methodist Church now in Kingston is known as the Cook Memorial Methodist Church. In addition to Norman Manley, a number of Jamaican students have studied at Jesus College. Ralph Carnegie, for example, the Rhodes Scholar, who matriculated in 1960, became a fellow and tutor in law at Jesus College from 1964 to 1970, before returning to work at the University of the West Indies in Barbados. During my time here, we have had many Jamaican students, such as Unique Campbell, a Commonwealth Scholar, now a lecturer at the University of the West Indies, and Kim Marie Spence, who is one of our speakers today. Jesus has also been a hub for research on Jamaica in Oxford. Let me just mention that done by our emeritus professor, Colin Clark, who was a fellow and tutor in geography from 1981 to 2003. Colin has published several books on urbanization in Jamaica, including Kingston, Jamaica Urban Development and Social Change, 1692 to 1962, and Decolonizing the Colonial City, Urbanization and Stratification in Kingston, Jamaica, published by Oxford University Press in 2006. Colin's contribution to college life has been immense, and to honor Colin, the college has secured funding to endow and name the position of one of the geography fellows after Colin Clark. So I'm delighted that from the 1st of October 2019, we now have the Paul Paget Colin Clark Fellow in Geography, a position that will remain in perpetuity. Paul Paget was a geography fellow who preceded Colin, And between them, they taught geography in this college from 1957 to 2003. So let us welcome Colin, who's our first speaker today, to speak about Norman and Manley's time at Jesus College. Welcome, Colin. And can we just cheer him for his...
Thank you very much, Patricia. Norman Manley was born in 1893 at Roxburgh Castle, a landed property in rural Jamaica, the third child of Thomas. European in facial features but dark in colour, young Norman occupied a privileged position in the Jamaican colour class hierarchy. Thomas Manley, though successful in the citrus business, ruined his family by his litigious activities, and following his death in 1899, the widowed Margaret Manley moved with her 4 children to Belmont, essentially a logwood cutting estate on the edge of Spanish Town. At the age of 13, Norman won a half scholarship to Jamaica College in Kingston. And when Margaret Manley died in 1913, the family leased their estate, and 3 of her 4 children left for secondary and higher education in Britain. Norman, orphaned at the age of 16, continued to live at Jamaica College, where he would remain on his own during the school holidays. Work, he claimed in his unfinished autobiography, and I worked very hard, and sports, and I did a bit of everything. Track, athletics, cricket, football, rifle shooting filled my life. In 1910, he passed the Cambridge locals with a second-class result, and a year later, when he was 18, won 6 medals in the Jamaican Schoolboy Championships, including the 100 yards in 10 seconds, an island schoolboy record broken only in 1952. Norman prepared for the Rhodes Scholarship. This is on leaving school. He prepared for the Rhodes Scholarship, which he won in early 1914, with a grade described by the leading Jamaican newspaper as of exceptional merit. But over the summer, Norman contracted typhoid and was seriously ill for several weeks. He found that his phenomenal speed and spring had gone, though he remained outstanding at the technically difficult events such as the long jump and the hurdles. Arriving in Manchester shortly after the outbreak of World War I, Norman travelled to Penzance and visited his widowed aunt Ellie, the sister of his mother Margaret. He was introduced to her family of 9 children, including his cousin Edna, who appeared white. Edna takes up the story recorded retrospectively in her 1969 diary. Into this august glory walked Norman Manley, scholar, sportsman, and a strange, strange personality. He had won the Rhodes, nearly died of typhoid, had a 100 yards record, which was a world record for a schoolboy. I was 14, and he stood there in front of the empty fireplace, his hands in his pockets, swaying, handsome, fawn-like, smiling mischievously. I studied him and met a mocking smile, and something somewhere deep down touched. As Norman was reunited with his brother and sisters, Jesus College and Oxford University were coming to terms with the dislocation of war in Michaelmas term 1914. The admission book for Rhodes Scholars describes him as a sound fellow of some character, rough in manner, not much evidence of intellectual ability, no particular denomination, but will attend religious service anywhere. Good at games. Calder says, good athlete, but coloured. No reference to Norman's colour is made in the Jesus College members list for 1912 to 32, nor in college magazine entries. There was no freshers' photograph taken at Jesus that year, and the college magazine, which was normally published termly, was discontinued for the duration of the war. Norman was admitted to read for the first public examination in law under the tutorship of Mr. Hazel, the law fellow, and successfully passed the examinations in June 1915. He had attempted to join the Officers' Training Corps in Oxford, but according to his Rhodes record card, was rejected as not of pure European descent. Denied the prospect of an army commission as an officer, in September 1915, Norman was called up for war service and with his younger brother Roy, was posted to the Royal Field Artillery, serving as an NCO in France between 1916 and 1918 and winning the military medal for non-commissioned officers in 1917. Norman's brother Roy, who fought in the same artillery unit, was killed in action at the Third Battle of Ypres in 1917. While on leave in London afterwards, Norman met Edna, then 17, at her mother's house in Neasden, their first encounter apart from their wartime correspondence since 1914. She recalled that he was utterly worn out and that Roy's death had done something quite terrible to him. Norman, often with Edna in tow, now attended concerts, plays and art galleries in London. By no means confident that the law would suit him as a career, nevertheless Norman enrolled to study for the bar at Gray's in London as an adjunct to his suspended Oxford course. Norman suffered severely for an extended period of time from shell shock sustained in northern France in 1918, and his recuperation in 1919 was slow and uncertain, though greatly facilitated by being sent home to rest for 6 months, as his Rhodes Scholars record reveal. Living in Neasden with her mother and sharing with her the nursing, Edna noted that in the evening firelight, Norman's hands made ghostly shadows on the wall. But we were there, we understood, my mother and I, and we tried to move in to fill the gap. At night we would dash into his room as the memories of war made the night hideous to him. Philip Sherlock, Norman's first biographer, concluded, slowly he mended, but was not completely recovered when he re-entered Oxford in 1919. Exactly 100 years ago this week, of course. The first 2 terms were a misery. Then he had the good sense to take his tutor's advice, forget about work for a term, and prepare himself for a course of individual study in the long vacation. Norman was once more tutored in law at Jesus by Mr. Hazel, but a short way into law finals, realizing that he was eligible for a war BA, which was awarded in the summer of 1920, he used the long vacation to prepare for the postgraduate degree of Bachelor of Commercial Law, the BCL. In other words, he very swiftly and sensibly moves from what effectively was, in those days, a wartime general sort of degree into something which was really very high-powered and a postgraduate qualification. The BCL, or Bachelor of Commercial Law, he achieved in 1 year with Class 2 honours in 1921. Of the 16 candidates, 3 received firsts, but some candidates took the course over 2 years and not one, as Norman had done. Between September 1919 and December 1920, Norman took 2 bar exams at Gray's Inn, in which he achieved first-class results, plus a first class in bar finals, where he ranked second on the list and won the £50 Gray's Inn prize. The Rhodes authorities in Oxford commented on these achievements. Able man, health not too good, but he did well, coloured. Writing from Oxford in early 1921, Norman nonetheless expressed to Edna his feelings of isolation and alienation. I have not made a single friend here. I cannot get behind the barrier that is always there. I feel chained. The case is different when I meet any of the many West Indians that I know. Edna was continuing to make her own way in London, though struggling to launch herself as a privately funded art student. Eventually, with her uncle's support, she completed her 2-year course at the St. Martin's School of Art. During this post-war period, Norman and Edna exchanged close on 1,000 letters. But this intense interaction masked the concealment of their true relationship from their respective families, a reticence engendered by issues of kinship, colour, age, and aspiration. Remember, at this time, Norman would have been about 28 years of age, and she is around about 19 or 20. Wayne Brown, Edna's biographer, wrote of Edna, unable for so long to make contact with her family, she made him, Norman, the companion of her hopes and touchstone of her emotions. Intuitively, she would seize upon significance he had not discerned, but in the end, she believed, his wisdom surpassed hers, both in breadth and in depth, and this made her feel safe with him. Returning to Oxford in Michaelmas term 1919, Norman excelled in the sprints and jumps at Jesus, as you perhaps expect him to, when he competed for the college against Merton. This was the first of their events. According to the Jesus College magazine, he won the hurdles in brilliant fashion and also first place in the long jump. He repeated this early success in the long jump and the 120 yards hurdles at the Jesus College Sports in March each year, winning the long jump and hurdles in 1920 and the long jump in 1921. He was awarded his college athletic colours in 1920, by which time he was clearly one of the best two athletes at Jesus, representing the college in the annual university sports competition and the Inter-College Athletic Cup. Norman and Edna's visits to art galleries and theatres and their joint love of English literature became the focus of their shared lives in London. It was a measure of his admiration for Edna's art that he took one of her early animal sculptures back to Oxford and kept it with him. That's two wolves, a plaster, which was made in 1920. These cultural activities had considerable bearing on Norman's Jesus College life, where the Neo-Hellenist Society provided a popular forum for the arts in 1919, its theme being modern literature post-1800. Norman was made a member that year, and in 1920 contributed to the discussion of Shaw's The Doctor's Dilemma, and was elected president for the Trinity term 1921, his last term at Oxford, of course. In May 1921, just before his exams for the BCL, Norman was awarded the university's Lee Prize for his essay on Samuel Butler, and Edna went to Oxford to see him receive it. Wayne Brown noted that it was the first time that she'd been with him in Oxford. I think found rather an astonishing fact to discover. And their mutual enjoyment suggests that Norman might have been reconciled to Oxford perhaps long before, if he had invited her to visit him earlier. The previous summer, Edna had declared herself coloured like Norman, thereby alienating her mother and several other passers-white members of her close family. And it was with some defiance on Edna's part that the couple married at Kilburn Registry Office in London in 1925, on June 25th, 1921, immediately after Norman completed the Viva for his BCL. The exams behind him, Norman spent the year 1921-2 living with Edna in North London while he attended Lord Chambers to complete his requirements for the bar. In May 1922, Edna gave birth to a son, Douglas, and at the end of August, all three of them travelled to Jamaica, where her second son, Michael, the future Jamaican Prime Minister, was later born. Norman's rise to legal fame as an advocate in commercial and criminal law, King's Counsel, 1932, his entry into politics in 1939 as leader of the People's National Party, his recognition by his old college when he was elected an Honorary Fellow of Jesus, 1958, his role as Premier of colonial Jamaica, 1959, leader of the opposition in independence, 1962, and as a Jamaican national hero, 1969, in the year after he died, all indicate the extraordinary status he achieved in the last 40 years of his life. While Edna supported him in his career at the bar and in politics, she herself rapidly developed as a sculptor in wood and bronze, modelling bead seller her first Jamaican work in 1922, and over a lifetime producing more than 200 sculptures, many of them large pieces occupying public open spaces in Jamaica. Edna reflected, "Life gave me a very unusual man to live with and to share, and a chance that very few women ever have." Their love and respect for each other enabled Norman and Edna to form the hub of a Jamaican network of artists and social scientists, not unlike the British Bloomsbury set. And the germ of this was to be found in the shared creative lives they enjoyed in Oxford and London, while Norman was an undergraduate and graduate at Jesus College.
Thank you, Colin. That was a really masterly summation, which was also spot on time. I'm just grateful for that too. And I mean, you capture both of them in a much wider frame, and it was remiss of me to welcome also members of Norman Manley's extended family here today. So that's sort of part of the wider recognition. Our next speaker is Michael Joseph, who is almost no longer graduate student here. His PhD has been submitted and he's waiting for the viva. So we don't want to dwell on that much further. So he's forbidden me from talking about that. He's currently M.G. Brock Junior Research Fellow at Corpus Christi College and works on anti-colonial thought in British and French Caribbean.
So, hello everyone. Can everyone hear me in the audience out there at the back? Excellent. So, I put the title of this little talk as Britain in Manley's Jamaican Nationalism. And that was one of those sort of placeholder titles that you put in when you don't exactly know what you're going to talk about, but you have some ideas, and it can lead you in lots of interesting directions. So initially I planned to talk a little bit about Manley's democratic socialist project, particularly in 1938 and 1939 when he sort of really bursts onto the scene in Jamaica as a politician. In between finishing sort of the end of Colin's story and the beginning of mine, he's very busy. As Colin mentioned, he undertakes a pupillage in London, qualifies for the bar, and is admitted to practice in Jamaica in 1922. He becomes King's Counsel in 1932, and after that is suddenly sort of this Oxford-educated lawyer to the Jamaican elite, effectively. When, in the 1930s, with the Great Depression, labour unrest erupts across the Caribbean and in Jamaica in 1938, sort of in particular, he finds himself representing the West Indies Sugar Company, which is a subsidiary of Tate and Lyle. So he's really kind of representing a company that is at the forefront of labour militancy and sort of the beginnings of real mass opposition to colonial rule. But in May 1938, he volunteers to mediate on behalf of striking workers on the Kingston waterfront. And this really kind of catapults him to prominence and establishes him at the head of a kind of labour-orientated anti-colonial movement. He becomes the head of the People's National Party, the PNP, and begins to set out this democratic socialist platform, which is very strongly influenced by Fabian traditions in kind of British Labour Party thought. So I was going to talk about all of that. But then I began to reflect a little bit about the black in Black History Month and where Manley might sit in relation to that. And I think in order to kind of reflect on that, we bring into view two different things. The first is the different valence attached to race in Britain and Jamaica and what we can sort of learn about that when we think about Black History Month. And the second is a different set of relations between Manley's nationalism and Britain to those that I've just outlined. So that's what we're going to reflect on in the next sort of 10 to 15 minutes or so. So what does it mean to celebrate Norman Manley during Black History Month? Viewed from Oxford, as we've seen so far, it's quite clear and unambiguous why that would be a logical and a reasonable and there's an obvious rationale to do that. But viewed from the Jamaican perspective, there's a kind of potential ambiguity involved. And one source of this ambiguity derives from how Manley understood himself. In his recent posthumously published memoir, the Jamaican cultural theorist Stuart Hall wrote the following of his upbringing in Jamaica in the 1930s and 40s, and I quote, "What Jamaica did I belong to? This puzzle preoccupied me as I was growing up. In part, it was a function of the colonial relation, of being othered to myself. But it was also due to my own social location in the brown middle class, which as a class was acutely conscious of its role as an intermediary formation and lay outside the world of the white planter elite. It certainly existed in an alternative cosmos to that inhabited by the poorer, darker multitude, These constituted what I call here the two Jamaicas, end quote. So when we think about race in the Jamaica into which Hall and a generation or so Manley were born, we need to think about colour and colorism. Hall describes a society in which class maps onto colour pretty clearly. So from the white planter elite, as he calls them, through to the poorer dark multitudes, in his own words, separated by a self-consciously distinct mixed race or brown middle class. And it was into this class that Manley was born in 1893. This class colour spectrum could also, to some extent at least, be traced through culture. So Hall, unsurprisingly, as a cultural theorist, makes a huge amount of this in his memoir. The two Jamaicas, as he calls them, differed in their dominant affective and cultural orientations, towards all things British on the part of the white elite, and towards more syncretic or creolized, we can think of them, African-derived traditions on the part of the black labouring classes. Race consciousness, Pan-African sensibilities, and so on made inroads into some sections of the middle classes in the 20s and 30s, particularly into the sort of the lower middle class. But the practices and traditions associated with middle class respectability in Jamaica were overwhelmingly white British in origin. So the point I want to make is that Manley was born into a class which, by and large, didn't identify with blackness. And this is particularly true of his formative years in the 1890s and early 1900s. So to return to my earlier remark, there is a certain ambiguity from the Jamaican perspective. Would Norman Manley have identified with the black in Black History Month? And on top of the question of how Manley viewed his own racial identity, there's the question of how others have assessed him, particularly from the standpoint of post-colonial Jamaica. Manley is revered in official histories of the Jamaican nation. As we've heard, during the process of post-colonial nation building, Jamaica reached for all the kind of traditional tropes that you would imagine with a formerly colonial state. And one of those was this idea of crafting a usable past for the new nation. And one of the methods they used for that is to create this set of national heroes. Manley fits very neatly into that. He's named National Hero on the 18th of October 1969. He's buried in National Heroes Park in downtown Kingston, alongside the likes of the 20th century's greatest Pan-African organizer, at least in my opinion, Marcus Garvey, and Samuel Sharp, who is an enslaved man and leader of the great 1831-2 revolt of the Jamaican enslaved. But critical approaches to Jamaican nationalism have long identified a continuity between the sensibilities of this brown middle class under colonial rule and the dominant framing of Jamaican nationalism as it emerged during the struggle for formal decolonisation. From these perspectives, the leadership offered by the brown middle classes, Manley, his cousin Alexander Bustamante, and others, produced what is often termed brown Creole nationalism. And this form of nationalism, these scholars suggest, was focused on reproducing Western models, seeing these as metrics for progress and modernity. So European cultural traditions, lightly creolized, the Westminster political system, and so on. Now, Rupert Lewis, a leading scholar of Caribbean political thought, has even gone so far as to suggest that Manley and his close political allies were, quote, deeply imbued with strong anti-black ideas in terms of how they saw themselves and their destiny. Similarly, Anthony Bogue's reading of Manley's 1938 political programme argues for, and I quote, the absence in Manley's political text of any developed analysis of colonial rule and the functioning of its political economy. Missing as well was any discussion on slavery and its meanings for and legacies in Jamaican society. This peculiar silence, it was 100 years since the final abolition of slavery, would mean the following. First, that any discussion or public analysis of race, class, and colour in Jamaica was blissfully ignored or downplayed. Second, that by ignoring slavery, Manley established a pattern in which Creole nationalism would pay attention only to one historical component of Jamaican society, colonialism. But Jamaica was a society in which colonialism reinforced racial slavery. Thus, any nationalist struggle that downplayed or ignored slavery could not tap into all the complex imaginings required for the new nation. So that's Anthony Bogue's assessment of Manley's 1938 political programme. So for Bogues, Lewis, and similar critics, Manley and the brand of Jamaican nationalism which he represented elided questions of race. And they believed that kind of forging the nation around these ideas of multiracialism, creolization, and so on served, according to these scholars at least, to marginalize affirmative black consciousness by pitting it against the nation. So the two things were seen to kind of not be working in tandem, but to be working at cross purposes. From this perspective then, for some of these critics and scholars, he would make an unlikely figure to celebrate in Black History Month. In the remainder of this talk, though, I want to suggest that these interpretations misread Manley's political project in 1938. Specifically, I want to argue that far from ignoring slavery, Manley's vision for Jamaica was rooted in his awareness of the legacies of slavery for the island's society and economy. That is, that we can find Britain in Manley's Jamaican nationalism, not just in his Fabianism or his veneration for British political traditions and models, but in a darker side, that of slavery, or to borrow from Walter Rodney, how Britain underdeveloped Jamaica. When we reread him in this way, we see in his project a sort of insurgent call to action whose significance, I think, hasn't quite yet been exhausted. So during the 1930s, Caribbean writers were grappling with slavery's central role in the making of the modern world. In 1938, C.L.R. James' brilliant retelling of the Haitian Revolution, The Black Jacobins, came out. In the same year, one of James's former students at Queen's Royal College in Port of Spain, Trinidad, Eric Williams, finished his doctoral thesis here at Oxford. And this was the thesis that, published in 1944, was Capitalism and Slavery. And both of these texts have been kind of major interventions in histories of abolition and capitalism, and they're texts which are still essential readings in their field, even 80 years on from their publication, which is very rare, even within history. And at the time, they were accompanied by sort of very deep political investments. This is work which has a sort of very, very clear political rationale in line with their work towards anti-colonial movements at home or in a sort of transnational sense. Now, Manley is not engaged in this type of historical work in quite the same way. He's not writing things in that sense. But he approached the same question about the legacies of slavery from a political and economic standpoint. Insofar as slavery had left land, wealth, and power concentrated in the hands of a white planter elite, an anti-colonial stance which sought to address the legacies of colonial rule effectively needed to reach beyond just the simple transfer of power. Specifically, Manley and the PNP saw in the plantation the symbol, symptom, and systemic root of the island's problems. No Jamaican political group had ever articulated things in quite this way before. They'd had critiques of Crown colony rule and how that sort of obstructed the free development of the political community, but there have never been any sort of diagnosis which really reached back into the legacies of slavery for the island and what structural effects that might have had. That was new for Jamaica when Manley and the PNP developed this project. Now, in the 1930s, this labour unrest which sweeps the island, in which Manley sort of gets caught up almost by accident, shapes his diagnosis of the role which slavery has played. And it shapes the diagnosis also of people like Noel Nethersole, who was a sort of near contemporary at Oxford. He was at Lincoln College before coming back to become vice president of the PNP later in his career. They see in the labour unrest clear evidence of their identification of the plantation and of slavery as at the root of Jamaica's problems. They trace its causes: unemployment, underdevelopment, low wages, inadequate land settlements, etc., all of those things to the plantation complex. The belief really is that Jamaican development had been hindered by this idea that, and I quote Manley in this case, "the general prosperity of the country is somehow or other bound up in the preservation of a number of large and well-managed estates, and that the settled peasant requires and should have access to large estates so as to be able to work for wages to supplement his earnings." These were deeply ingrained beliefs, Manley said, but they weren't true. Crafted and perpetuated to serve the interests of the white planter elite. This idea that if you were an agricultural worker and you had your own land, that you should also be a wage labourer, because that was really the only way that the island's economy could function, would be by having these plantations that were served by this mixed workforce. In response, Manley and the PNP proposed a programme which they termed, quote, rural reconstruction, a nationalist statist policy of agricultural development. I'll only discuss the central pillar of this today, and that's radical land reform. So the plantation in this vision was to be completely superseded as the main unit of agricultural production. What Manley proposed was a land settlement board, which would be empowered with compulsory acquisition powers, and initially £2 million, which at the time is a phenomenal amount of money, to invest in a self-sustaining land settlement scheme, which would ultimately phase out the plantation almost entirely. So the plan really is to have this board that will buy up estates, split them up in order for rural workers to buy up land to become self-sustaining. It was well known, particularly to people like Manley, that small planter yields fell far short of what could be achieved by large estates. It's not as efficient a way of organising agricultural production. He was quite happy to admit that he didn't imagine that peasant production could ever outmatch existing estate figures. But the purpose of rural reconstruction and its dismantling of the plantation was not principally economic, at least not in a sense measurable by export statistics or production rates and so on. Rather, it reflected Manley's belief that slavery, through the plantation system and as evidence in the late labour turmoil, had deformed Jamaican social life. Underdevelopment, low wages and limited access to the land had driven the rural poor into crowded, unsanitary conditions in Jamaica's towns. So Kingston's population swelled by almost 75% during the interwar years alone. So the PMP's vision for Jamaica then was about undoing this demographic shift. On the one hand, its intentions were quite radical. The compulsory redistribution of landed wealth away from a white elite, whose dominance stemmed from a history of slavery. On the other, it entailed a sort of conservative project to forge a moral or, quote, civilized citizenry capable of benefiting from the advent of democracy. These new settlements out in the country, in which agricultural production would be based on the cooperative system, and this is really where his inspiration was drawn from the Fabian writers in Britain, were the centerpiece of this vision. It was essentially a very patriarchal vision of the future, one in which the nuclear family would be elevated as the core building block of civil society to restore a social fabric which had been deformed by the legacies of slavery and then finally torn apart by the labour unrest of the 1930s. So just to very quickly wrap things up, where was Britain in Manley's Jamaican nationalism? Yes, of course, it was there in the Fabianism and in the constitutionalism and so on. It was there in all of those places. But it's also there in a very trenchant critique of the legacies of slavery, which structured Manley and the PMP's vision for what post-colonial Jamaica should look like. So while I think that there are critiques to be made of Manley's political thought insofar as it relates to race, it's far from the case that he was missing an analysis of that altogether. And just to close, I would say that in this call for a sort of self-surpassing nationalism, able to undo the legacies of colonialism, I think we can find a message for ourselves here at Black History Month and beyond, which is to sort of attempt to go beyond representation and to pursue decolonization instead, to really attack the structural legacies of colonialism and racism rather than just kind of their visible effects. Thank you.
Thank you, Michael. That was an excellent follow-on to some of the issues that were raised by Colin's talk. I'm sure there'll be lots of interesting questions and discussions later, but we're going to move straight on to hear from Dr. Kim Marie Spence. Kim was a Rhodes Scholar and Jesus alumnus. She's currently a postdoctoral researcher in the School of Media Arts and Technology at Southampton Solent University. Her research focuses on cultural policy and cultural industries, especially on creative cities, technologies, and transnational cultural flows. Kim is also an adjunct lecturer in film at the Caribbean School of Media and Communications at the University of the West Indies. And she's been going around launching her recently published book entitled The Global Cultural Economy, which she co-authored with an academic in Australia. Kim can say more about that because she'll be launching it in London soon, according to her Facebook page. So Kim, over to you. You're going to talk about Edna Manley and her impact on Jamaican culture.
Does this work? Oh, okay. It's warming up. So, thank you, Patricia, for having me here. It is an honor to be back in this hall. I remember first walking into Jesus College, where I had no idea that Norman Manley actually attended this college. I chose it because it was Welsh. As a Rastafarian, I just couldn't see myself existing under the cross of St. George, so I could do the Red Dragon, and that's why I came here. So I screamed at dinner because I saw that portrait, and it confirmed for me that I had made the right choice and that my intersectional imposter issues would survive this journey. But my personal connection to the Manley name actually started with Edna Manley. So I knew of Edna Manley before Norman Manley, which is probably a heresy for a Jamaican to say. I grew up in the neighborhood right beside the Edna Manley College. And so every day after school, I would pass that college and associated it with a life that I was very curious about, the arts and culture. But coming from a farming background, that was not what the people in my family did. And so, every day I'd say, one day I'll go to the Edna Manley. So I'm very thankful that I was able to be on the board. Didn't actually go because I write about culture because I have no talent. So here we go. But my own personal experiences with the name of Edna Manley, along with my own study of pop culture and cultural industries, informed this presentation. I'm glad that Colin gave us a very good summation, because for me, I chose to call this Her Legacy and Cultural Capital, because this presentation is less about the personhood of Edna Manley, but just what she has done, not only in the legacy to Jamaica, but in terms of some of the issues that Mike talks about in changing what it means, what Jamaican cultural capital means, right? I am struck by the way Edna Manley's own artistic, political, and institutional journey mimics much of what various cultural philosophers write about. We can think of Benedict Anderson and the importance of the arts and culture in nationalism and in the imagined communities which support nationalism. We can think of Fanon, black skin, white mask, and some of the colorism and racial confusion in the post-colonial journey. And then with George Lamin in The Castle of My Skin, and just a racialized response to life in a post-slavery society or in a post-colonial world that is structured around whiteness, and to find that juncture in art. As we know, looking around us, we're led to think politics does not only happen in Parliament, it doesn't only happen in street protests, but it also happens in studios and on TV. And when I think of Edna Manley, I think some of her work foreshadows in many instances and parallels the political journey to Jamaican selfhood and nationhood. Interestingly, I thought, thinking of Edna Manley, these were the two most recent works that came to mind. First, we have Cara Walker's 2014 Giant Super Sphinx, which has interesting Norman Manley connections, because this is a giant sugar sphinx in the Domino sugar factory, of which Norman Manley was a lawyer. We won't talk about that. And then you have the 2016 Kehinde Wiley's Rumors of War, which was just put up in Times Square recently. And just the fact that art is not only about aesthetics and beauty, but about conversations that people are unwilling to have, but by putting it in the public space, you force the general nation and the collective to deal with these issues, the legacies of slavery, the rumors of, and the warmongering in which we are presently based. And I believe that Edna Manley's Negro Arouse did no less than that. This was a revolutionary stance when you think of the context that in 1935, Edna Manley created this sculpture. And it transformed the elements of cultural capital in Jamaica, because it refocused cultural capital less on Eurocentric notions, but on notions of the yearning of, for want of better terms, the black masses of Jamaica. This statue continues to stand on the waterfront of Kingston, and is one that I would see again every day. So I walked a lot around Kingston. And just, I remember as a child looking at this and feeling that sense of my issues and the issues of lower class Jamaicans and black Jamaicans are also not just economically important, but aesthetically and culturally important. And this statue also was a foreshadowing in the sense that it was before self-governance in 1944, with which Norman Manley was intimately involved, and was a premonition of the labor movements of 1938, 100 years after the end of slavery and the year of the founding of the People's National Party. Cultural capital, as defined by Bordeaux, is the accumulation of knowledge, behaviors, and skills that a person can tap into to demonstrate one's cultural competence and social status, coming from Pierre Bourdieu's 1973 Cultural Reproduction and Social Reproduction paper, co-authored with Jean-Claude Passeron. Edna Manley came to Jamaica with Norman Manley in 1922 after the war in which Norman had served and they had lost a brother, but also after the race tension involved with the West India Regiment, in which Norman faced his color and his race for the first time. The West India Regiment went to war as part of the British Army, but largely served as laborers and servants to their white colleagues. And then, of course, in 1919 here in the UK, with a number of racial riots, such as in Cardiff, etc. Her involvement with Norman was also, as Colleen Clark mentioned, part of her political journey, but also her racial journey as well. Her artistic journey started here in England and was characterized by paintings of animals and nature, with the first work that she sold being The Lion and the Eagle, with a lion conquering an eagle in a linear cubist style. I don't think any images of that remains. I was searching for weeks. And her style would transition to something curvier and more bulbous. And that conversation in style would go back and forth, especially as she adapted to the available materials in Jamaica, having the plaster from England barely survive that maritime journey, an issue she no doubt understood, having to flee Jamaica and come back to England in 1923, just being unable to fit in to the colonial society of Jamaica. When Edna Manley came to Jamaica, and particularly as a female artist, she spoke of arriving in Jamaica and realizing that all the nice lady artists did landscapes. She, on the other hand, much to the puzzlement of her contemporaries, sketched figures from the market, the road, and people would scratch their head and wonder what was going on. She, however, noted the approval of the staff and of the servants in the house. And I quote from Horses of the Morning, "I like that. Make him head a little bit smaller. Wait, that is the post." And they appreciated recognizable depictions of themselves and their lives in her work. Her first exhibition in Jamaica in 1932 is proof of that. There was no Jamaican imagery in Jamaican art at the time, as stunning as that might seem. Young children drew pictures of market women who were blonde and with white faces. But having studied different post-colonial cultural policies and cultural scenes, it is not an unusual situation. In fact, one of the reactions to her first exhibition was one writer wondering, so why didn't she do a great sportsman, a good English cricketer? Why these people? A further comment on what it meant to have cultural capital in the 1930s in Jamaica. So I know Colin mentioned bead seller, so is there a point? No, okay. On the left, you have bead seller, which was her first work that broke through. It's as the name, a bead seller. It was originally called the supplicant. And it was her first work in Jamaica in 1922, and the first body of work that got allowed for her entry into the London group. We have Norman, and that was the best one I could get, a bust of Norman that she did in 1924, and also shows a thematic of doing various members of her family throughout her life. And then the torso, which is what her style evolved to. So one can see the journey from the bead seller to the torso, and also the use of different materials along the way. And I call this, in her work you could see the transition and the acclimatization to Jamaica. The awareness of the provincialism of the art scene was not lost on either her nor Norman, who himself worried about the impact on her practice of being so far away from the cultural center being London. A comment on the enduring legacy of colonization, even now in where we consider the centers of culture to be. The cultural economy cities, and that's distinct from those that claim the title, but the ones where are actually the center of cultural business, remain London, Paris, Milan, with the addition of American interlopers such as New York and Los Angeles. If one wants to make it, you head to these cities, and it was no different in Edna Manley's time, and she went in the opposite direction. Nevertheless, she broke through, and she was allowed entry into the London group with exhibitions in London throughout the decade of the 1920s. Her fascination, though, with the life of the average Jamaican, including the folk tales, the religion, would animate her concern that these be present in the cultural life of Jamaica, not only in her work, and in her initiatives in that direction, both in terms of her own drumblair group, which I'll talk more about later, and her work. She was part of the changing of what it meant to be cultured in Jamaica. As with Negro Aroused in 1935, her work also foreshadowed other political developments. We see here Puckamania on the right, 1936, and Brother Man, 1961. Puckamania and Brother Man, a figure of Rastafarian imagery, both represent a continuing interest and respect for a religion that comes from the mass of Jamaica, Puckamania, Rastafari, and not those that came with the colonizers, Christianity, etc. Deborah Thomas and Barry Chevans, two sociologists and anthropologists from different eras, and of note, describe the religion coming from the masses, not just as religions per se, but also as means of cultural resistance. The rejection of more of Eurocentric images and understandings of the world, even in the face of oppression, points to this and is important in the move towards an independent Jamaican nationhood. The emulation of a British cricketer would never capture that. As I mentioned before, in 1944, Jamaica would become self-ruling with its own House of Representatives, and Norman Manley would become premier from 1955 to 1962. In an era in which political spouses are heavily scrutinized, look, I know more about Kate and Meghan's wardrobe than I know about my own. In researching Edna Manley, I found that parallel useful as well. Edna Manley was no less driven than Norman Manley, not just in terms of her artwork, but also her cultural outreach. Drumblair had two sets of visitors. So Drumblair was a home that one of the many homes that the Manleys occupied, but one in which, as Colin put, they had a Bloomsbury group. I actually wrote they created something parallel to a salon of French philosophers. That's what I'm obsessed with the French Revolution. But they had two sets of visitors, the political figures for Norman Manley and the artists to see Edna Manley. Rachel Manley, in her book Horses of Mourning, rightly, I think, cites them as cultural nationalists, not just artists. The importance of that artistic drumblare gathering is made clear in the list of its members. Vic Reed, who wrote New Day chronicling Morant Bay Rebellion, John Hearn, Basil McFarlane, Roger Mays, who wrote The Hills Were Joyful Together, and Brother Man. In an era where their marriage across color lines, despite their familial relationship was difficult, Edna Manley had her own audience and interest, which has led to her being named the mother of Jamaican art by a number of different commentators, not because she was Norman Manley's wife, but likely in spite of it. Edna Manley's diaries also show her political support. She was even one of the judges for the PNP's party emblem in 1944. But she also encouraged the much recognized, well now recognized, Louise Bennett to work in youth clubs. As by her own words, she recognized the importance of the cultural side of clubs, not just the labor and productivity elements. She encouraged the exploration into Jamaican culture through many means, not just through her own practice, but through literary culture. She edited the journal, the literary journal, The Focus, in the 1940s and 50s, and has received numerous awards, the Gold Musgrave Medal, an honorary Doctor of Letters from the University of the West Indies. But there is also the space that her work occupies in the public, so not just the different groups that she started, but also Rachel Manley writes of Edna Manley's earliest introductions to the working class. But the identity of its people, culture as it had been forged from the crucible of history, seemed always out of reach, lying like a bedrock beneath a complete underbrush of mistrust and understanding, from middle-class fear and repudiation to expatriate difference and indifference. Edna Manley described the middle class as being in a curious state of self-prejudice, well, the Jamaican middle class. Well, it might be a comment on middle class generally, but not my forte. But, in curious state of self-prejudice, fearing the Jamaican lower class and that state of survival and poverty, but also coveting the expatriate life from which they were wholly excluded. She also noted in that a beginning of an awareness of a need for a history, not just of enslavement and colonization. She looked around and realized that there were no black heroes depicted in any monuments in Jamaica, only Nelson and Queen Victoria. Any book of history began with Columbus. How can a proud people start their history at the moment of capture? So it was at that time she decided to volunteer at the Institute of Jamaica, where she taught for free and taught junior classes, which I'll come to later. But we know, I've already spoken about Negro Rose, but you also have the Paul Bogle statue. Paul Bogle is one of the Jamaican national heroes, with not quite as a well-developed ethos, well-developed philosophy as Marcus Garvey, but was instrumental in the fight and rebellion in St. Thomas. So it was decided, she was commissioned to make this public statue of Paul Bogle and giving the people a mythology and a hero. The negotiation with the people over Paul Bogle points to the issues of creating that new mythology within Jamaica. When Edna Manley visited, and as has been noted before, Edna Manley is white passing, whichever is the appropriate term. The people noted to her that they wanted a living leader, and they wanted a picture that showed a man coming back, not not a king, but a living leader. And so hence that helped with this, helped her in her portrait. An element that continues in how Jamaican public art is framed. And this is Redemption Song from Emancipation Park. I will close with noting her other legacy, which is the Edna Manley College, the one I grew up beside. These are three of the works from three of the most noted artists of this decade, Ebony Patterson, Olivia McGilchrist, and Philip Thomas. Edna Manley would never have known that when she gritted her teeth and returned to Jamaica and started giving free art classes at the Institute of Jamaica, that this would be her legacy, the Edna Manley College of the Visual and Performing Arts. From being wary of judging drawings in which all the children were blonde, and it's hard to imagine that now, Edna Manley and a few of that drum blare set started a journey to the creation of the Edna Manley College. And in this, I note that I close with the lessons from Edna Manley are artistic, institutional, feminist, and even about relationships with a powerful partner. It's not hard to imagine that Jamaica would have had a different sort of independence if Edna Manley had been a different person. And so I argue that it's not enough for us to focus on the creation of political leaders, but every movement requires cultural and artistic leaders as well. Thank you.